a harsh expanse of scorched earth and cracked stone that seemed to swallow everything it touched. Daniel Cole moved slowly across it, shoulders bent beneath the weight of an old canvas pack. Every step pressed into the sand with the heaviness of someone carrying far more than his body should endure. His boots were worn thin, soles nearly separating, yet he pressed forward with grim determination. Beside him trudged Ash, a weathered bay stallion whose ribs showed faintly beneath a dull coat. The horse's hooves crunched softly with each stride, the sound muffled by the desert wind. Together, they looked like remnants of a forgotten world, a man and a beast tied not by choice, but by survival. Daniel's eyes narrowed against the glare, though they were already marked by fatigue. His face, sunburnt and etched with lines deeper than his 35 years suggested, revealed both endurance and pain. He was a veteran, a soldier once honored and later forgotten. His medals, once polished and pinned proudly to his uniform, lay in the bottom of his pack like discarded trinkets. What mattered now was not glory or recognition, but simply making it one more day. Ash gave a low whinny, almost as if voicing his own exhaustion. Daniel reached out and laid a hand on the animal's neck, the touch both steadying and grateful. "Easy, boy," he muttered, his voice hoarse from thirst. "We're still moving. That's something." The desert wind carried faint whispers, or perhaps it was only Daniel's mind replaying the echoes of war. He had seen too much, the chaos of explosions, the cries of men who never returned, the silence afterward. These memories came to him in fragments, cruel flashes that never left. Sometimes he walked with his eyes half closed, and the desert transformed into a battlefield. He could almost hear the sound of boots pounding beside him, his brothers in arms alive again, if only for a fleeting illusion. He always shook himself free, forcing the mirage away. Ash would nudge him then, a reminder that the world in front of him, however barren, was still real. As the day stretched on, heat waves shimmered off the horizon. Daniel's lips cracked as he swallowed against dryness. Hope was scarce out here, but he moved on because stopping meant surrender. It wasn't a soldier's way to surrender. The horse faltered slightly on a loose stone, and Daniel steadied him, whispering, "Just a little longer." He had no clear destination, only the faint belief that somewhere, something might exist beyond emptiness. Late in the afternoon, his eyes caught sight of a structure in the distance. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, another phantom born of heat and hunger. But as they drew nearer, the shape sharpened, broken walls, a rusted gate, the remnants of what had once been a proud outpost. He stopped, squinting at the ruins. They looked abandoned for decades, windows shattered, roof beams leaning precariously. It was a carcass of stone and steel, but unlike the desert, it offered shade. More importantly, it offered water. He spotted the remnants of a stone well near the center of the compound. Reluctantly, Daniel guided Ash inside. The place felt haunted, as if voices still lingered between the cracked walls. Dust coated everything, and weeds curled up through fissures in the stone floor. He dropped his pack with a thud and let Ash drink from the shallow, murky pool that collected at the well's bottom. Kneeling beside the horse, Daniel scooped water into his hands and drank. It tasted of rust and earth, but it was life, and that was enough. As twilight settled, Daniel built a small fire from scraps of wood and watched the flames flicker against the ruined walls. The outpost mirrored him too closely for comfort. Once useful, once strong, now forgotten and left to rot. He could not decide if this was a blessing or a cruel reminder. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the crackle of fire and Ash's steady breathing. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a fragile thread of safety, though it was wrapped in decay. His thoughts drifted back to the moment that had driven him from society. Returning home from the war, he had expected, hoped, for some semblance of belonging. Instead, he found distance in the eyes of neighbors, whispers that he was unstable, broken, a shadow of the man who had left. Jobs came and went, each one ending with the same hollow dismissal. The world no longer needed soldiers. It certainly didn't need him. And so he drifted, searching for meaning, carrying only his scars and his horse. Ash had been left behind by another soldier, unwanted, too stubborn to tame. Daniel had seen something in the animal's wild eyes, something that reflected his own turmoil. From that day, they were inseparable. The night deepened, stars spilling across the sky like shards of glass. Daniel leaned back against the cold stone wall and let his gaze travel upward. The vastness made him feel both small and strangely alive. Ash moved closer, lowering his head to nudge Daniel's shoulder. The gesture pulled him from the spiral of memory, grounding him in the present. Daniel rested a hand on the horse's muzzle. "We made it another day," he whispered, voice breaking with quiet gratitude. In that moment, a memory surfaced, not of violence, but of a lesson once given by his commanding officer. "Build where you stand, soldier. Don't wait for perfect ground, because it doesn't exist. Make it yours." The words had been buried beneath years of noise, but now they returned with startling clarity. Daniel looked around at the ruined outpost, at the shattered windows and leaning beams. It was nothing, yet it was something. A place. A start. His chest tightened, torn between resignation and an unfamiliar stir of resolve. Could this broken shell of stone mean more than temporary shelter? Could it be rebuilt, piece by piece, just as he was trying to rebuild himself? The fire crackled lower. Daniel lay on his side, eyes still open, staring at the jagged silhouette of the gate against the stars. Ash shifted his weight and settled beside him, body radiating warmth into the cool desert night. Daniel reached out, fingers brushing the horse's mane. "Maybe this isn't the end," he murmured. The words were soft, almost lost to the wind. His eyes closed at last, and sleep came, heavy but not empty. For the first time in a long while, he felt a seed of something fragile stirring within him, not quite hope, not yet, but the faint possibility of it. By morning, he knew he would decide. The outpost could remain a ruin, a forgotten mark on the desert. Or it could become something more, something alive again. As the stars wheeled overhead, Daniel's last thought before sleep was a whisper meant only for Ash. "Maybe this is where we start again." The morning sun rose over the outpost, painting the broken walls in hues of gold and amber. Daniel stirred from the hard ground, his back stiff, his mind still tethered to fragments of dreams. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the sight of Ash standing patiently by the well anchored him. The horse's eyes met his with quiet steadiness, as if reminding him of the promise whispered in the night. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbed his face with calloused hands, and pushed himself to his feet. He had stayed. That choice alone marked the beginning of something he could not yet name. He surveyed the outpost in the cool of dawn. It was worse than he remembered. Cracked beams hung precariously, walls crumbled into jagged shapes, and rust devoured what remained of the gate. Still, beneath the decay, there was structure, a skeleton worth holding on to. Daniel set his jaw, pulled a rusted crowbar from his pack, and began the work of clearing. Each heave of stone, each shove of debris, was like peeling away layers of neglect, not only from the outpost, but from himself. The labor was slow, punishing, yet it anchored him in the present. Ash followed closely, tugging at brush with his teeth, nudging stones aside with his hooves, as though determined to share the burden. The day grew hotter, sweat dripping from Daniel's brow as he scavenged scraps of wood and metal. He fashioned crude supports from broken planks, wedging them into place to keep walls from collapsing further. His hands bled from splinters, his muscles screamed, but there was a stubborn satisfaction in seeing one corner of the ruin hold steady. When he paused, he caught Ash watching him, ears twitching, as if approving of the effort. Daniel chuckled dryly. "Guess we're both stubborn," he said. Speaking aloud felt strange, yet necessary. Silence had become too heavy, and the horse's quiet presence made conversation feel less foolish. By midday, exhaustion overcame him. He slumped against the wall and pulled from his pack a dented tin can of beans, eating slowly while Ash grazed on sparse weeds nearby. The taste was bland, metallic, but it reminded him of simpler meals once shared with men who were now gone. The memory pierced deeper than he expected. He closed his eyes and saw their faces, smiling, teasing, alive in a world before blood and fire stole them away. His chest tightened, guilt gnawing like a hidden wound. Why him? Why had he survived when better men had not? The question came as it always did, and as always, there was no answer. He reached for Ash, running a hand along the horse's neck to steady himself. The animal leaned into his touch, grounding him in the moment. When the sun dipped low, Daniel resumed his work. He gathered scraps of cloth from his pack, tied them around his raw hands, and pressed on. Piece by piece, the outpost began to change. Not much, but enough to spark a glimmer of order amid the chaos. A corner cleared of rubble. A half-stable patched with crooked boards. A fire pit built with stones that once littered the floor. They were small victories, but Daniel felt them keenly, as though each accomplishment stitched him back together. That night, sitting beside the fire with Ash close by, he allowed himself a rare smile. It was faint, fleeting, but real. Days bled into one another. Each morning he woke to the same resolve: repair, rebuild, endure. His body toughened with the rhythm of work, his spirit steadied by the presence of Ash. At times he spoke to the horse as though to a comrade, recounting old battles, regrets, even the names of those he had lost. Ash listened silently, eyes soft, head tilting at the sound of his voice. In those quiet exchanges, Daniel felt less alone, as if his words did not vanish into the air but were carried, held, and understood. Yet shadows of the past remained. One evening, as the sky burned red, Daniel sat with Ash and drifted into memory. He saw again the ambush, the blinding flash, the screams of his brothers. He heard the last breath of his closest friend, a man who once dreamed of buying land, raising horses, and living a quiet life after the war. Daniel clenched his fists, guilt surging. That dream had died with him, but perhaps, in some strange twist of fate, Daniel had inherited it. Maybe the outpost was more than shelter. Maybe it was the dream his friend never saw fulfilled. The thought cut deep but also lit something fragile within him, a sense of duty not to the dead, but to their memory. The first sign of another human presence came unexpectedly. A faint crunch of gravel outside the gate stirred Daniel from his work. His body tensed, instincts sharp from years of survival. He gripped the crowbar like a weapon, heart pounding. A figure appeared in the fading light, a young boy, perhaps no older than 15, clothes ragged, eyes wide with curiosity. He froze at the sight of Daniel, and Daniel froze in turn. For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by Ash's restless snort. "What is this place?" the boy finally asked, voice cautious. Daniel studied him, uncertain whether to answer. Trust did not come easily. "It was nothing," he said at last, his tone rough. "Now I'm trying to make it something." The boy's eyes flicked across the outpost, lingering on the patched stable, the cleared grounds, the faint order rising from ruin. A strange respect crossed his face. "Looks like you're building more than just walls," he said. The words struck Daniel deeper than expected. The boy lingered a moment longer, then slipped back into the desert night, leaving Daniel with thoughts he could not shake. That night, he sat by the fire in silence, the boy's words echoing. More than just walls. The phrase burrowed into him, unsettling but undeniable. He looked around at the rough beginnings of order, at Ash standing tall despite weariness. Perhaps the boy was right. Perhaps this was not only survival. Perhaps it could be a foundation for something greater, something that might matter beyond his own struggle. Sleep came fitfully, filled with shifting dreams of fire, laughter, loss, and rebuilding. When dawn returned, Daniel rose again with resolve sharper than before. He worked harder, pushing past pain, driven not only by the need to endure but by a flicker of belief that others might one day find refuge here. He did not say it aloud, not even to Ash. But deep down he began to wonder if the outpost could become more than his shelter, if it could become a place of belonging. As the days stretched forward, Daniel's heart carried both burden and spark. The ruins were still vast, the work endless, but the vision grew quietly in his mind. He did not yet know how, or when, or if it would come to life. But with each stone lifted, each board nailed, each whispered story to Ash in the quiet of night, he felt the possibility taking root. He was no longer only surviving. He was building.
ChatGPT said. Daniel woke before dawn, the air sharp and cool against his skin. The ruins lay cloaked in shadow, yet even in half-light he could see the changes he had carved into the stone. The outpost no longer looked entirely abandoned. Where rubble once sprawled in chaos, order had begun to take form. A rough fence encircled a corner of the grounds, the stables patched enough to shelter Ash, a small fire pit arranged neatly in the center. It was far from whole, but the progress was undeniable. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the stirrings of purpose. He rose, brushed the dust from his clothes, and whispered a steady command to himself. "Keep going." The days stretched into a rhythm of toil. Each morning, he scavenged among the wreckage for wood, stone, or scraps of metal he could repurpose. His hands grew rougher, his muscles leaner, his body adapting to the demands of labor. Ash worked alongside him, dragging beams across the courtyard, carrying supplies, and standing by with quiet patience whenever Daniel faltered. At night, the pair would rest near the fire, Daniel often speaking in a low voice about the battles he fought, some in the desert, others inside himself. The horse, though silent, anchored him in those moments. Their bond deepened, no longer only survival, but a partnership forged in trust. One afternoon, as Daniel hammered rusted nails into a repaired gate, he heard footsteps beyond the walls. His grip tightened instinctively around the hammer, old instincts flaring. A group of locals appeared, 3 men in worn hats and dust-caked boots. They stood at the threshold, eyes roaming over the half-restored ruins. Suspicion thickened in the air. One of them spoke, his voice edged with disdain. "What's a broken soldier doing out here, wasting time on a pile of rocks?" Daniel straightened, sweat running down his brow. He had expected curiosity, perhaps mockery, but the bluntness still struck hard. The men muttered among themselves, shaking their heads at the sight of patched walls and crude repairs. Another scoffed. "You'll die out here, same as anyone foolish enough to try." Their words lodged deep, stirring old doubts he thought he had buried. For a fleeting moment, he imagined abandoning it all, leaving the ruins behind before the weight crushed him. But then Ash stamped his hooves against the ground, snorting as though to challenge the intruders. The sound snapped Daniel's attention. He rested a hand on the horse's neck, drawing strength from the solid presence beside him. His voice came low but firm. "Maybe I will. But if I don't try, then I've already given up." The men exchanged glances, some amused, others unsettled. After a moment, they turned and left, their footsteps fading back into the desert. Daniel stood silent long after, hand still on Ash's mane, his pulse steadying. He realized then that this was no longer about convincing others. It was about refusing to betray his own resolve. That night, the firelight flickered across Daniel's face as he stared into the flames. Memory rose unbidden, sharp and cruel. He saw his closest friend, Matthew, lying in the dirt of a battlefield, eyes wide and unblinking, words cut short by the chaos of war. Daniel's throat tightened as he recalled the dream Matthew had shared countless times. The dream of land, of horses, of peace after violence. Matthew had never lived to see it. Daniel clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. "You should have been here," he whispered to the night, grief raw in his voice. Ash shifted beside him, lowering his head until his muzzle pressed gently against Daniel's shoulder. The contact unraveled him, and for the first time in years, Daniel let the tears fall. The following days brought new urgency. He worked harder, as if each strike of hammer or lift of stone was done in Matthew's name. The outpost grew sturdier, more recognizable as a place one could belong. A fence enclosed a wider stretch of land. The stable, though rough, could now house more than one horse. A section of the wall stood solid against the wind, a small claim against the desert's endless erosion. It was still a ruin, but no longer lifeless. Then, as if testing his newfound resolve, hardship struck. One evening, after hours of hauling timber beneath the unforgiving sun, Ash stumbled. At first, Daniel thought little of it. The desert was unforgiving, and both of them bore exhaustion daily. But when Ash's knees buckled and he collapsed onto the dirt, fear surged through Daniel's chest like a blade. He dropped to his knees, hands frantic as he checked for wounds, whispering desperate reassurances. The horse's breaths came shallow, body trembling from strain. Daniel's mind spiraled, terror and helplessness colliding. This horse was not just his companion. Ash was his last tether, the one being who had kept him alive when despair threatened to swallow him whole. "Don't leave me," Daniel begged, his voice breaking. He stayed by Ash's side through the night, refusing to rest, feeding him water in slow sips, stroking his mane with trembling hands. He spoke as though Matthew might hear, as though all the ghosts might listen. "I can't bury another brother. Not again." The hours dragged, every minute heavy with uncertainty. Daniel's exhaustion blurred the edges of his vision, but he held on, unwilling to surrender. At dawn, just as the first light spilled across the courtyard, Ash stirred. His chest rose deeper, steadier, eyes fluttering open. Daniel let out a breath that was half relief, half prayer. He leaned his forehead against the horse's neck, whispering, "We're not done. Not yet." The ordeal left its mark. Daniel realized how fragile their struggle truly was. One storm, one illness, one collapse could end everything he had fought to reclaim. For the first time, he admitted the truth. He could not do this alone. The thought unsettled him, stirring the same unease he felt whenever society brushed too close. But he could not ignore it. The outpost could not stand on the strength of one man and one horse. That evening, as he lit the fire and watched the sparks rise into the dark, Daniel weighed the choice before him. To remain alone was safer, familiar, yet it meant risking everything if either he or Ash faltered again. To seek others, to open this place to people beyond himself, was to invite both help and hurt. He stared at the ruins around him, now alive with the faintest hint of order, and felt the weight of his friend's dream pressing on his shoulders. Perhaps the outpost was not meant to remain his solitary refuge. Perhaps it was meant to become something larger. Ash shifted beside him, strong again though still weary. Daniel laid a hand against the horse's warm flank, his voice steady though quiet. "If we're going to make this stand, we'll need more than just us." The words hung in the night, both a confession and a vow. The fire cracked, embers rising into the sky like sparks of possibility. For the first time, Daniel's vision stretched beyond survival. It reached toward the idea of community, of belonging, of a home that could shelter not only him, but others wandering lost as he once did. And though he could not yet see how, the decision had been made. He would not remain alone. The morning came with a restless wind, carrying dust across the courtyard, as if the desert itself meant to test Daniel's resolve. He rose with a determined heaviness in his chest, scanning the outpost he had fought to reclaim. The walls stood stronger than before, patched and braced, but they were still fragile, much like himself. Ash pawed at the earth nearby, tail flicking, as if sharing the same unease. Daniel's decision of the night before lingered, echoing in every glance around the half-repaired grounds. This place could not endure with only him and the horse. If it was to survive, if it was to mean anything, others would have to come. Yet opening himself to people again felt like pulling old wounds wide. He had built these walls not only from stone and wood but from silence, and silence had become his shield. Breaking it would demand more courage than the battlefield ever had. Later that day, as he worked on reinforcing a section of the stable roof, the crunch of approaching footsteps reached his ears. He froze, instinct flaring, then slowly turned. The boy who had once wandered here returned, this time with two others, an older man with sun-baked skin and a woman carrying a bundle of supplies. They stood cautiously at the threshold, their eyes sweeping across the outpost, taking in the visible signs of progress. The boy spoke first, voice carrying a note of conviction. "I told them what you're doing here. They wanted to see it for themselves. Daniel lowered the hammer in his hand, his body taut with suspicion. He had grown used to solitude, mistrust etched into his bones, yet he could not deny the flicker of relief at the sight of other faces. The woman set her bundle down, dried food, cloth, small tools, and met his gaze with steady calm. Places like this shouldn't stay dead. You've already brought it back to life. Let us help. The offer cut through him, like both a balm and a blade. Help was dangerous. Help meant reliance. Reliance meant risk. But then he saw Ash, standing tall behind him, ears perked toward the strangers. The horse had carried him through silence, through collapse, through grief. But Ash alone could not hold the weight of a dream. Daniel felt his guard falter. "If you're here to mock, leave," he said at last, voice low. "But if you're here to work, then work." And so they stayed. The man lent strength to heavy lifting. The woman stitched repairs into cloth and patched wounds Daniel had long ignored. The boy carried water, fetched tools, and trailed after Daniel with eyes that seemed to drink in every movement. Together, they breathed life into the outpost in ways Daniel had not managed alone. The walls rose higher, steadier. The corral widened. A faint rhythm of community pulsed through the ruins, fragile but unmistakable. Daniel moved cautiously among them, words measured, trust slow. But each day he found himself loosening the chains around his voice. Yet the desert was not content to let peace settle easily. One evening, clouds rolled in thick and dark, winds whipping with the force of an approaching storm. Daniel felt the tension in the air, the crackle of lightning hidden behind the horizon. Memories of chaos returned unbidden, sandstorms on patrol, structures collapsing under fire, voices crying in the night. He shook them off and gathered the others. "Secure everything. Tie the boards. Bring the animals inside." His voice carried command once more, not the bark of a soldier, but the urgency of someone who had seen what storms could take. The gale struck with violent force, rattling the patched walls, tearing at the new repairs as if mocking their efforts. Rain lashed down in sudden torrents, soaking wood and flooding the courtyard. Daniel pushed against the wind with the others, nailing boards into place, hauling stones to brace the gate. Ash reared in fear, but Daniel's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding. "Easy, boy. Hold steady." He pulled the horse close, pressing a hand to his flank, anchoring him with calm amid the fury. For hours they fought, bodies aching, breath ragged, until at last the storm relented, leaving silence heavy as lead. When dawn broke, the outpost bore scars. The fence lay twisted in places, the roof of the stable partially torn away, mud thick in the courtyard. Yet it still stood. They still stood. Daniel looked upon the ruin within the ruin, and felt not despair but pride. Where once he might have abandoned the effort, this time he saw more than loss. He saw resilience, a refusal to yield. And when his gaze shifted to the people around him, exhausted, mud-streaked, but alive, he saw something he had long thought impossible. He saw belonging. The others looked to him instinctively, awaiting direction. It startled him at first, this quiet recognition of leadership, but it settled naturally upon his shoulders. He nodded once. "We rebuild. Stronger this time." His words carried certainty, not only for them, but for himself. Ash, standing beside him, snorted in approval, as if echoing the vow. The days after the storm became a new chapter. The damage forced them closer, their labor shared, their burdens divided. Daniel found himself laughing once, quietly, at a jest the boy made while hauling timber. The sound startled him, as though it belonged to another man, yet it felt real, unforced. At night, as the fire burned in the courtyard, the silence no longer pressed on him like a weight. Instead, it hummed with the soft presence of others, with the rhythm of voices telling stories, with Ash lying calmly nearby, the flicker of flames reflected in his dark eyes. Daniel still carried the war inside him, the scars, the ghosts, the questions without answers. Those would never vanish, but for the first time since returning, he felt those burdens no longer defined him entirely. They were part of him, yes, but not the whole. The outpost had given him a mirror of his own brokenness, and in repairing it, he had begun to repair himself. With each stone lifted, each board nailed, Each quiet night shared with companions and horse alike, he built not only shelter, but meaning. As the sun set one evening, casting the outpost in warm hues of orange and gold, Daniel stood at the gate with Ash beside him. The ruins no longer felt like ruins. They felt alive, pulsing with work, with memory, with hope. He ran a hand along Ash's mane, his voice low, almost reverent. "We did it, didn't we? Not alone this time." The horse nickered softly, pressing his head against Daniel's shoulder, as if in agreement. Daniel's gaze stretched toward the horizon, the endless desert no longer a void but a frontier. He thought of Matthew, of the dream that had once been spoken in quiet tents and smoky nights. That dream now stood around him, battered but unbroken. A place to belong, a place to start again. He whispered to the memory of his friend, to the ghosts that lingered, to the life he was finally learning to reclaim. From ruins, we built something worth standing for. The fire crackled behind him, voices murmuring, laughter faint. The outpost had become more than a refuge. It had become a sanctuary, not only for him, but for anyone searching for a second chance. Daniel drew in a slow breath, the weight of the past still present, but no longer crushing. For the first time, he felt at peace with the road he had walked, the pain he had carried, the scars he bore. He was no longer just surviving. He was living. And as the desert night fell around him, one truth burned steady within. He and his horse had built something that no storm, no war, no despair could erase. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.